Now, my new book was all recorded from an old man. The stories in it were recorded from an old man in a mental hospital. And wonderful man he was. He knew his area like, you might say, the hairs on the backs of his hands. In detail, going back. He knew about landlords, he knew fairy stories, he knew every crossroads in that place, blessed wells, God only knows what. Now, in this book, I'm only giving a sample of the recordings that I made of him in that place back in the 1980s. That's 40-something years ago, but so I'm so delighted that I did that because, as I say, in the back cover here, he must be probably the only person in that place that got a chance of telling his own story. Now, here's one of the stories he told me, and what a memory that man had. Could I do this? Well, I doubt it. He said, I heard a good one from an old woman one time. It went like this. The day before yesterday, about 40 years ago, I got an empty letter of an old hag's death. I was so delighted at the sad news that every tear that fell from my small toe would split 6 feet of rock or set a mill going. I got a fit of running with my 2 shin bones in my pockets and my head under my arm for 16 miles, every minute sitting down, until I met John Dervis, the coachman, driving 16 dead asses under an empty steam coach loaded with 2 roasted millstones, 17 man-o'-wars and half-baked paving stones. I went into Bernard Wang's and I asked him, could he give me any account or information about the shower of old hags that fell next week? He said he couldn't, but John Manx could. I asked him where did John Manx live. He told me he lived in the round square house beyond all parts of the 3 flying asses, up and down a street where a mad dog beat a hatchet and where the pigs fight for stirabout. So I crossed into a small village about the size of Dublin, where I saw a man running off with a load of chimneys on his back. He had a colic on his big toe, a toothache on his shin bone and a headache at the back of his knee. I sent for a coach to convey him to a doctor's shop where I ordered a physic of 17 quarts of pigeon's milk, 18 pounds of frog's butter, 9 pints of eel's beestings and 70 rogue's kidneys. A robin boiled into rags, and I mixed them up together and I boiled them into a leathern, wooden, iron calico pot. After he had taken the physic, I brought him to a hospital where he got a fit of coughing for 18 days and 18 nights without stopping. And after this he threw up strikers, seekers and hikers, foxhounds and greyhounds, harehounds, badgers, cur dogs, lapdogs and spaniels, and they all marched off to St. Helena to bring back Bonaparte, and they'll be back on the 12th, the hungriest month of the year. And he goes on and on and on and on for about 5 more minutes in the same vein. Well, I tell you, it makes no sense, and yet in the middle of it all there's a vein of a kind of sense, and it finishes in this way. He says it was composed for a wake, and the reason was that in wakes long ago, they used to go on for 2 days and 2 nights, you see, and fellas used to get bored and they'd be falling asleep, and you had to be kept awake for something. You had to be kept awake somehow. And how would you keep people awake? Do something, and do anything. Keep them laughing, for example. And long ago there used to be wake games, and some of the wake games used to be outrageous. And I tell you, Sean O'Sullivan, in his book Irish Wake Games, he tells us about some of these wake games where, for example, sometimes the corpse would be taken out of the coffin and would be waltzed around the kitchen walls, the dead person. Now, nowadays we would say, what in the name of God kind of savages were they in Ireland long ago? But of course they weren't. They weren't like that at all. It was just a matter of sometimes reverence, would you believe it, reverence for the dead person. A way of saying, look, join in the fun. we won't be seeing you again. So you're welcome to join in for a last dance. And so they danced the dead person around the kitchen. They used to have a sing-song. And all kinds of games. And sometimes the dead person would be asked to join in a way of speaking. You won't be seeing me again. And they would be kind of insulted if they didn't ask the dead person to join in. Now, if the thing got too rowdy, of course there'd be always somebody there to say, hey, hold on a minute, no. There's a thin line between reverence and blackguarding. So this was one of those things. This was one of those crazy rhymes that went on to make people laugh at such a thing like that and keep them awake and make sure they didn't, because that would be a worse insult to the person who was dead, that you'd fall asleep and get bored. Huh? What kind of a reverence would that show to the person that was dead? That he was a boring old fat of the woman who was dead? No, that wouldn't do. So this was one of those things, and it went on. I'm only reading a little bit out of the start of it. A very, very funny thing. But the point is that the man that told me all these stories, he remembered it over about 40 years later. And that man was in a mental hospital. It'll just show you the serious part of what I wrote here, that such people were put into mental hospitals long ago, where they had no business, a lot of them, they had no business being.